All right, hi everybody. I thought I would talk about some of the books I've been reading recently. I've gone on sort of an immoralist pagan bent and journey. I was reading uh, this book, Oscar Wilde, His Life and Confessions by Frank Harris. I'm almost done. Um, this book is very good. It's kind of, Frank Harris apparently was known for being a little bit of a fabulist, so there might be aspects of this book that are exaggerated. I read a Spectator article from the 60s reflecting on this guy's life. He died in like 31, so he had been dead for some time by then, but the author of that article was reflecting on his nature and what it was like knowing him as he had known him personally. And that author took I'd say was doubtful about one particular story that Frank Harris tells, which is the one where, upon being finally bailed out after his initial arrest, his trial in relation to indecency, not the failed libel trial that Oscar Wilde himself initiated, but um, his he's arrested for indecency. I guess the trial hadn't happened by that point, actually. But he is finally able to come home 3 weeks before the trial. Now, Robert Ross and one of Robert Ross's friends are documented as having encouraged Wilde to escape from the United Kingdom on a yacht. Frank Harris tells the story, but he attributes the yacht idea to himself. Actually, it may not have even been like when other people speak of this story and they don't mention Frank Harris, they may not even mention a yacht. It may have just been, oh, he was encouraged to flee and leave by his friends. Frank Harris tells the story of a yacht. There's no way of verifying if it's true or not, but and his portrait of Wilde does seem fairly accurate. The way he has him speak does sound like Oscar Wilde. Frank Harris had written a book called My Life in Love, or My Life in Loves, pardon me. And in that book, he's known to have kind of exaggerated and made stuff up about famous people. But this book is about one single person, and I don't know, the nature of Oscar Wilde's life, and apparently um, I'd say the respect he commands out of Frank Harris makes me not want to think that Frank Harris lied too much in this book. It's also the fact that he's got a letter in here from Lord Alfred Douglas, who was Oscar Wilde's boyfriend, sort of, I guess. So he did in fact know these people who knew Oscar Wilde, and they were aware of his book, and they were aware of the claims he was making, and could have counter-signaled it. And there's a biography that Alfred Douglas was like a co-partner on that perhaps one can read and balance against this one. But the general story is correct, and the details of the trial and whatnot are correct. He goes into the history of the law that was invoked for arresting Oscar Wilde, and it was one that was passed like 10 years prior to his arrest, called I think the Criminal Amendment Act of 1885, that had come out of a moral panic about sex trafficking in London, where a moralizing man put out a bit of a hysterical pamphlet that was, Frank Harris says, was full of exaggerations and untruths, but was alleging that there were children were being sexually trafficked across London. So they passed an amendment meant to target, I guess, prostitution and licentiousness and general indecency. So I think I haven't looked at the letter of the law then, but it seems like it must have spiraled beyond what it was intending to do. And Frank Harris says during deliberation over the passage of that law, a member of Parliament who was kind of like a liberally minded person, jestingly said, well, why don't we even go so far as to, if we're going to ban indecency even, why don't we go so far as to criminalize relations among the same sex and make that criminal and indecent? And the people who were in favor of the law, who were filled with a moral panic, as Harris tells it, said, "Oh yeah, fine. Why don't we do that?" And that was the basis for how something that a law that was inspired by somebody telling exaggerated, fomenting hysteria over child sex trafficking. I'm glad that's nothing that yeah, in many ways. Some aspects of what drives the public conversation, I guess, remain ever constant. But that was utilized to arrest Oscar Wilde, and put him in prison or hard labor for 2 years. And then he injured his ear during that time and wasn't treated. And medical doctors at this point say that's what killed him. It's rather curious. Anyways, by the way, if you heard a little chime and jingle there, that was my email, not yours. Don't worry about it. I've muted my computer. But yeah, there's a memoir in here, a small memoir by George Bernard Shaw. Frank Harris apparently promoted George Bernard Shaw's plays in the Saturday Review, where he was, I think, the editor-in-chief for some time. So, he tells a story about how George Bernard Shaw and himself, Frank Harris, when Oscar Wilde was going through, considering the libel suit, Shaw, Harris, and Oscar were meeting to talk about it. Lord Alfred Douglas came in later. Shaw and Harris were both saying, "You're going to lose this. You shouldn't go through with it. You should probably get out of the country and wait for any scandal surrounding you to disappear." And Lord Alfred Douglas said, "Anyone who thinks this is no friend to Oscar Wilde at all," and kind of became irate and stormed off. And then Wilde left as well. Alfred Douglas's letter that is provided at the beginning of the book, as well as an account of what Alfred Douglas hated about the first edition of the book. So again, Harris is balanced in the sense that he is aware of criticism of some aspects of his portrayal. The specific ones are not related to the yacht detail, but characterizations of certain individuals, specifically Lord Alfred Douglas. So he even encourages a preface or an introduction that includes some of Lord Alfred Douglas's rebuttals, but that includes a letter where he confesses, to the fact that Oscar Wilde was a homosexual, that he was too, that they were in this relationship. But he goes into the details where he had initially been planning to provide testimony himself during the initial libel trial against Oscar Wilde. For those of you who don't know, what led to Oscar Wilde getting arrested was that he was very close with Lord Alfred Douglas, and people were kind of gossiping about it. They appeared to be in a homosexual relationship, but it was one of those things Victorian morality often likes to look away from certain things. So it was sort of a blind eye was turned to it, or at least people weren't sure. They didn't think about it too much, or they just thought that it was a strange closeness, but it wasn't sexual. Lord Alfred Douglas's father, who's the Lord of Queensberry, and is called Queensberry usually, left a note at a club, some bar for Oscar Wilde, saying that Oscar Wilde, who poses as a sodomite, and it was misspelled. It was Queensberry was a really kind of a vulgar, irate, person who's bellicose, get into fights, scream at people, was apparently a huge dick, was very cruel to his family, to Lord Alfred Douglas, to Lord Alfred Douglas's mother. So anyways, Oscar Wilde sees the note, and he launches a libel campaign against Queensberry, and that starts the investigation. But what happens is the defendant, Queensberry's lawyers, start bringing in people, young men who were supposedly in obscene relationships with Oscar Wilde, and it starts to look really bad for Oscar Wilde. So he ends the suit, but in this process, more has been learned about him, and it starts seeming like he's in violation of these indecency laws, and that leads to his arrest, and then that leads to his trial, where he's the defendant for obscenity. Okay, so when they were discussing what to do and whether a libel suit should initially be pursued, George Bernard Shaw and Frank Harris agreed that this shouldn't happen. Lord Alfred Douglas became emotional and said no, he should. The allegation against Lord Alfred Douglas that people who look back on this make, and people around the time period make following the ordeal when they could reflect on it, was that Lord Alfred Douglas did hate his father and wanted to use Oscar Wilde as a battering ram against Queensberry. Now, Lord Alfred Douglas says in his letter that he had a plan to testify against his father and reduce one aspect of the claim, which is that Lord Queensberry was trying to defend the honor of his son. And Alfred Douglas wanted to say that this man has not been a father to me, and he was going to outline how they had hardly had contact over the last 10 years throughout his life, and he wanted to turn the jury against his father. But the lawyer representing Wilde decided not to go through with this testimony, and there's of course all this debate over whether or not it would have even been permitted at all, and all this stuff. But Alfred Douglas said if he had testified, the trial probably would have gone differently, and he blames Wilde's lawyer for leading to Wilde's disaster. So anyways, I hope that was interesting. I was just interested in also just reading Shaw's account, and I haven't gotten to it because I was initially just going to read the memoir, but I was like, no, I actually want to read this whole thing, and it's quite good. Yeah, I've got other books to talk about, but this video's already been pretty long. I mentioned Wilde as a sort of pagan. Frank Harris refers to Wilde as a pagan, as a natural pagan, as somebody who could never have been a Christian. And he says that Oscar Wilde even called himself a pagan born outside of his time. So Wilde was a part of a number of artistic movements happening towards the end of the 19th century, fin de siècle, associated with the decadent movement, sort of, but pagan sensualism. These people who were very much into aesthetics, pleasure, and were not morally uptight. And some of these people would be kind of considered characteristically pagan in a way. There's a moment where Oscar Wilde says he was seen shirtless with Lord Alfred Douglas, or he was like, they had been washing, they were near a body of water, they were washing off, and Lord Alfred Douglas starts spraying him with a hose while while Wilde is wearing only a bath towel, and a priest came and saw them and freaked out, and Wilde goes, "Oh, you've stumbled into a perfectly Greek scene," that kind of stuff. Anyways, I find it interesting because the way we look back on this is like, oh, he's like, just some gay, like some LGBTQ, like, I don't know, like it's strange when he speaks about the love that shall not be named, which is a famous part of his trial, where people, the way that gets told is it's like specifically a homosexual thing, but he stood by this through his life. But what he was speaking about was something very particular, and he's talking even about a kind of like spiritual pederasty, right? It's like he says it's always between an older man and a younger man, one of whom is an intellectual, another who has, and I'm paraphrasing, a kind of like zest for life. And he seems to say it's something like, even, you could say it was the nature of the trial for him to do this, but he probably believes this in part, that it is not necessarily defined by any sexual component behind it. And then regardless, and when he says like older and younger and all that description, that's more than something that's just like gay. He's not like, oh, we're like, and that, but it's not untrue that he's a gay man, and that's quite essential. It's just like kind of reductive to just say, to think like, oh yeah, he was, that it's kind of depriving his specific perspective and the way he was in the world and the things he enjoyed that were associated with his sexuality. It's like depriving them of their nuance and special character if we just kind of flatly, like, I don't know, like he was in there waving the rainbow flag in the courtroom or something. I mean, I don't know. Maybe this is take that sentiment or discard it. But yeah. But anyways, yeah. But it's interesting. So then, by the way, because then we live in our understanding then of this subculture of humankind is very much modified by the particular moment in time that we're in, a secular era, an era where there's gay civil rights and all this stuff. Back then, if you were like this, the cultural context is a little bit different. So it's like you're a pagan and you kind of are a little bit of an anti-Christian in some ways. Wilde was always very charming, and he liked to play with morality. He didn't like to sort of crassly attack it. He liked to tease. And there's a story Frank Harris says about Aubrey Beardsley, who made these famous illustrations for a sensual work by Wilde called Salome that was originally printed in French. And these drawings were kind of notorious because they had, nudity and hermaphroditic characters. And Beardsley apparently was kind of a more sort of vicious anti-Christian in some regard, or at least he could be. And Harris tells the story about how Wilde and Beardsley were talking about Nero. Wilde makes some charming comment about Nero, but then Beardsley goes on to say, like, oh, and don't forget, he lit those Christians up like tallow candles. And Wilde was not very into that sentiment. And so Frank Harris says he had viewed that moment as a key into why those two men eventually had a falling out, which is that Wilde didn't like open cruelty. But he describes Wilde also as being kind of something of a narcissist, or like very... there was a part of him that had very much contempt for the common person, but he was very delicate about it. So anyways, yeah, that is an example of the sort of culture that Wilde was in. Okay, this was super long and rambling and boring as shit, so we'll end it. Have a good one.